my name is Noah Mosley, and thank you so much for watching. And we have finally made it to the Australian Grand Prix. And in this video, we will be recapping the qualifying and the racing odds preview for the weekend. So let's go ahead and let's get into it. All right, looking at the biggest controversy going into the race weekend, the biggest news was who was going to drive alongside Charles. Was it going to be Oliver Bierman, who had a great outing in Saudi Arabia, or was it going to be Carlos Sainz coming back from his appendicitis? Well, we did receive news as of today that Carlos is expected to be in the car going into the race weekend this weekend. Looking at the rest of the Australian Grand Prix weekend, this is a home race for Oscar Piastri and Daniel Ricciardo. This is a track that they are both very familiar with, and so I'm expecting very strong performances out of them both. Looking at the track layout itself, I believe it's a good mixture of high-speed corners along with some low-speed corners and not very many straights. So I believe that the track does provide pretty good racing. We saw a lot of chaos in last year's race, especially towards the end. So I am predicting at least a couple of safety cars to come out and provide us a little bit more action than what we've seen in the first couple of races. All right, now getting into the qualifying odds for the race weekend. Starting off with my shot in the dark to take pole position, I have Oscar Piastri. Oscar is sitting at plus 8,000 odds over on ESPN Bet, and this is Oscar's home race, so he is going to have the most amount of fans here and present at the race, and he's going to want to perform. And this is also a track that he knows very well. In fact, he was actually a grid kid way back in the day, and there's actually a photo of Oscar being a grid kid, and it just goes to show, you know, he grew up around the track. He's very familiar with the track layout. So I feel like this is a very strong performance that Oscar can have and can pull it out, especially because he finished P4 in Saudi Arabia in the race results. So I think he could pull Mystery out of the bag and hit that pole position. So lock it in for Oscar Piastri. All right, who I have for my potential lock to take pole position, I have Fernando Alonso. Fernando is sitting at plus 3,000 odds over on ESPN Bet, and this year's Aston Martin is still showing a lot of pace, a lot more pace than where they were at last year towards the end of the season. They definitely dipped off towards the middle of the field, but here they've had another strong start to the season, and looking at last year's results, Fernando put a P4 in qualifying, and I believe he could just pull an upset out of nowhere because it's Fernando Alonso. So go ahead, lock him in for your potential lock to take pole. All right, and who I have for my best bet to take pole position for the Australian Grand Prix is George Russell. Now, George is sitting at plus 2,200 odds over on FanDuel, and George finished P2 in qualifying last year here at this race, and I believe that the Mercedes car itself performs very well in this track, and as we saw in the previous two races, Mercedes hasn't really figured out their car and understand where they need to develop and further enhance. And I think this is the track where they make that step, they make that stride, and they understand, hey, we know exactly where we need to improve on, and this is our strengths, and this is what we're going to hit for to improve. And so I think that George has shown a lot of maturity this season. He's still shown to beat Lewis in qualifying, and you know, I think that he can pull an upset and lock it on pole position. And I just feel like something's going to happen for Max this weekend. I just don't see him landing pole, so go ahead, lock George in for your pole position. Ready now, looking at racing odds predictions, who I have for my shot in the dark to win the Australian Grand Prix is Carlos Sainz. Now, Carlos Sainz is sitting at plus 3,000 odds over on DraftKings, and this is the only sportsbook that has Carlos Sainz as of yesterday before the news had dropped. So essentially, these odds could be subject to change. However, I will say this is my long shot just because he is coming off of appendicitis surgery, and he does perform very well in that Ferrari. I just don't know that he is going to be up to that 100%, you know, willing to throw it into the corner for, you know, 70 laps essentially. So that's the reason of why I have him being my long shot. So, you know, I would say it's decent odds, and his car is arguably the second best on the grid, and so I think he could potentially throw it on and win the race. So lock him in for your shot in the dark. Alrighty, and who I have for my potential lock to win the Australian Grand Prix is Checo Perez. Now, Checo is sitting at plus 1,200 odds over on FanDuel, and Checo finished P5 last year after, you know, DNFing qualifying, and essentially I thought that was a very strong performance out of himself. Even though that there was a late safety car that had mixed everything up, I thought that Checo still had a very great recovery drive. The Red Bull is still the best car on the grid, and so there's no reason that, you know, Checo can't get out in front and maintain that lead when he does. And so I think that in his first couple of performances, he has held strong to, you know, coming out very strong, very well, and performing where he needs to be at that Red Bull. And I think that it carries over onto this race. So go ahead, lock him in as your potential lock to win the Australian Grand Prix. Alrighty, and who I have for my best bet to win the Australian Grand Prix is Charles Leclerc. Now, Charles is sitting at plus 1,800 odds over on FanDuel, and I know that Charles is starving for a victory. When looking back at the 2022 season, he was going back and forth with Max over race victories, and I know that he wants to get back to that point very desperately. He doesn't necessarily want to be competing to get on the podium. He wants to compete to win the race, and I know that he is starving as all ever to get back to that point. And to be fair, Ferrari has necessarily taken their focus out of the pace for qualifying and put the focus more into, hey, we need to make sure that our car has the ample amount of race pace. And I think that we saw that in the first couple of races, that it can have a very strong race pace, especially when out in front with clean air. And so I would say, let's see how it goes. I'm predicting that Max is going to have some issues throughout the weekend, and so I'm not predicting it being an easy, clean victory for Max. So let's go ahead and let's lock in Charles Leclerc for our best bet to win the Australian Grand Prix. Alrighty, if you don't like my predictions, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to throw up the qualifying odds chart for you. And I'm also going to throw up the racing odds chart for you to go ahead and take a look at and throw the money on your best driver on the best sports book that will win you the most money. And essentially, that's what we want to do here. We want to make sure that you feel confident in your bet, and also you're using the best sports book to get you the most amount of money in the future. So, you know, that's all I had. Thank you guys so much for watching today. Looking ahead, I'll have the recap video coming around Tuesday, probably, after the race concludes. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you guys again for watching, and happy racing.